Hello, welcome everyone to this plenary called Dividing and Connecting Religion and Norwegian-American Life. And the talk is going to be given by DeAne Lagerquist. So welcome to her and to all of you. And DeAne Lagerquist is a scholar of American religion and the history of Christianity. She earned degrees from California Lutheran University, then known as California Lutheran College, Lutheran Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota, and the Divinity School of the University of Chicago. She attended the University of Oslo International Summer School in 1983. For 3.5 decades, she taught religion and American studies at St. Olaf College. In her book, In America, the Women Milk the Cows. The men, the women. Yeah, there's a typo in the, yes, thank you for correcting that. In America, the men milk the cows then, from 1991. She investigated the role of religion, ethnicity, and gender in the Americanization of Norwegian immigrant women. Locating Lutheranism combines Olaf Norley's early 20th century data with 21st century technology in a digital presentation of Norwegian-American religion, particularly in Minnesota. Her research and teaching interests include China missionary Gertrud Solvik, St. Olaf College president Lars W. Boe, Lutheran women's organizations and ordination, and Christianity in India. So, welcome to DeAne Lagerquist.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to see all of you, some of you again, some familiar and friendly faces, and some new people. There are several sessions in this interesting and rich conference about religion, and this one is really a kind of a big, broad strokes overview. If hearing Gertrud Solvik's name and China Mission is interesting to you tomorrow, one of the last plenaries will focus on the China Mission, and I'll talk more about Gertrud Solvik, who has been my companion for about 10 years now. I'm not going to say much about developing scholarship on so many topics, but it's really been a joy in these days. It feels like it's been many days to see the directions that this field is taking recently. As I said, I'm going to talk about, in kind of a very broad way, quite differently than those of you who heard Ralph Meyer yesterday focused on institutional things. I want to think about particularly the intersections of Norwegian ethnicity and religion. And because it's really easy to talk a long time at the beginning and then never get to the end, I want to give you sort of my takeaways right up front. Okay, so you know what it is I'm trying to construct and demonstrate. So the first thing I want to say is that migration separated Norwegians from their familiar religious institutions, and at the same time, they carried their shared religious culture and customs with them. So already we have this connecting and dividing going on, right? There's geographic division, but the culture comes along. In the US, some of those Norwegians affiliated with newly founded Lutheran institutions, but others joined non-Lutheran religious groups. And thankfully, we've heard about some of those just this morning. Some became Mormons, some became Pentecostals, some became Methodists, some became Baptists, some even became Unitarians. And the rest, it's always hard to trace the people who don't stay, right, who aren't affiliated with things, but there were a lot of other Norwegians who didn't join religious groups at all. Within the Norwegian Lutheran organizations, there were divisions that were based, at least, on differences of theology and piety, probably exacerbated by some other factors, perhaps sometimes class, for example. By the mid-20th century, things have changed, and I'll come to that, but the relationship between religion and ethnicity is loosening. Okay, so that's my big aerial view. So let's move on. This is where I'm going to go. I'm going to talk about religion and ethnic formation. I want to talk quite a bit about the American context in which these things happened, and then about some mediating institutions. What were the locations, the social locations, in which these interactions were taking place? And then I'll come to those shifting dynamics a little bit later. I'll simply say about this map. Some of you know the work of O.M. Norley, who was phenomenal. I often wonder what the man would have done with a spreadsheet and a database. And you heard about my digital project Locating Lutheranism. We thought we would be able to find that out. And one of the things we discovered is that, he has that 2 volumes of all those congregations that you see here on this map. The addresses, Google Map doesn't like his addresses because they're like 4.5 miles southeast. Doesn't really work. But there you see these locations of congregations mimic, of course, where Norwegians were. Okay, religion and ethnic formation, huge, enormous topic. The first thing I want to say about it is that religion and ethnic formation is not a topic that is constrained by Norwegians and Lutherans, right? Every immigrant group we could look at, there's probably some interaction of ethnic identity and religion. So this picture here is a congregation of Korean Presbyterians in the 1940s. Some of the most interesting work, in my view, that's going on about religion and ethnic identity is really, actually, Korean evangelicals. But also all of the new immigration, people like Steve Warner and his students are working on that a lot, and it gives us interesting points of comparison and contrast between the things that were going on among Norwegians. If that's something that is interesting to you and you travel to New York, I would recommend to you Scott Hansen's book, City of the Gods, which is about Flushing, Queens, and to see the ways in which there are some similarities and some differences. Of course, what's going on with religion and ethnicity is that we have at least 2, what Jerry calls complementary identities, right? And sometimes those come into conflict. And sometimes they're in competition. There's not one way that works. It works in various ways. Paul Spickard, in his book, Almost All Aliens, sets out to think about what leads to the formation of social groups, particularly ethnic and religious groups, ethnic and racial groups. He argues that he wants to think about those as variations on the same category. So of course there's shared ancestry, but for the shared ancestry to carry forward, there need to be other things. And one is shared interests, usually economic and political, shared institutions, and shared culture. So with the case we're looking at today of Norwegian-American immigrants, of course there's shared ancestry. There's not a lot of question there. Not so much, I think, about economic and political interests, except maybe during the period of English only. But there are lots of shared institutions, such as congregations and schools and other organizations that I'll talk about today. And there's also that shared culture that I said they left the institutions behind, but they brought the culture with them. Hymn books, catechisms, these sorts of things. The way you celebrate Christmas, confirmation. Spickard is also interested in what are the sort of models that are used to think about ethnic identity. These are a combination of what were the expectations at a given time and how scholars try to understand what went on. And this could be a whole conference on its own, so I'm not going to linger here, but I simply wanted to identify that he talks about, in his very long book, he uses three models. He talks about immigrant assimilation, right, or Anglo-Saxon conformity, pan-ethnic formation, and transnational diaspora. The idea of immigrant assimilation, to some degree, some of those Norwegians who I said didn't join Lutheran churches, but perhaps joined Methodist church that had no ethnic identification, their religion is working toward assimilation, right? Because, and I know there are examples of people who very deliberately decided, I don't want to be a Lutheran with a lot of other Norwegians because I want to learn English. And so I'm going to go to the Congregationalist church or the, whatever. So sometimes religion can work toward assimilation, but in a situation in which the organization, right, the shared institution, has a close, almost conflation of Norwegian ethnicity and Lutheranism, it can work against assimilation. Similarly, the church can work toward pan-ethnic assimilation, formation, when there's cooperation, and that's one of the things we'll see happening here. I think transnational diaspora is maybe the least useful for our purposes today. The American context. The American context is really, really different. How is it different? What are the key characteristics of the American religious landscape? We have this beautiful photograph by Dorothea Lange that's called Freedom of Religion, Three Denominations. What are the things that required adaptation? Of course, immigration requires adaptation. You want to make whatever it was you used to eat before, and you have to try and find those ingredients. And if you don't have those ingredients, how do you adapt, right? Maybe you aren't used to using an oven, and now you have an oven, and you have to learn how to do that. So what are the things in the American context? Most importantly, I think, is legal disestablishment. So we all know the First Amendment of the federal Constitution has both disestablishment, that there will be no established church, and free exercise. Sometimes these come into conflict. It means, one of the things it means when you don't have establishment, as had been the case in Norway, is that all the religious organizations, and I use that term deliberately instead of church, because it happens, whatever your religion is, whether it's a synagogue or a mosque or whatever, you can be self-governing, you must be self-supporting, and you also have to be self-propagating. Stephen Warner, in a long article called Toward a New Paradigm, argues that a key thing about understanding American religion is not about secularization, which this article came out in the 90s, had been kind of a way people were thinking about American religion. It's secularization, we become less and less religious over time. He says, no, that's really not what we need to think about. What we need to think about is it's an open market, which means there's competition and there's voluntarism. Nobody has to associate with the church. If nobody has to associate with the church has to offer something that it will make worthwhile, right? So this open market and competition. How have Lutherans adapted to that in general? I want to speak here not specifically about Norwegians. In the 1920s, H. Richard Niebuhr, in his book, The Social Sources of Denominationalism, identified Lutheran churches as immigrant churches, right? He said that's what distinguishes Lutherans, is that they're immigrant churches. In the 1970s, when Sidney Ahlstrom, who was himself a Lutheran from Cokato, Minnesota, wrote his magisterial, A Religious History of the American People, you keep it with the reference books because it's so comprehensive, he put Lutherans and Catholics, and I'm thinking Orthodox together in a section called Countervailing Traditions, right? So these two scholars both seem to suggest that these are churches that are kind of outside of the mainstream. They're outside of what's expected of American religion, which means they're in some kind of, what's going on? We don't quite fit. How do we make ours? Do we want to not fit, or do we want to fit? What are the adjustments that have to be made along the way? Over time, the last point in my big generalizations, big broad strokes, over time, Lutherans will move into the mainstream. So that today, if you look at Pew Research data on the American religious landscape, most Lutherans, show up as mainstream, but then particularly the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod and the Wisconsin Synod and some few other groups go with the evangelicals. Okay. The group we're most interested in today are those Norwegians who became Lutherans. So here I've suggested at least, let's say, 1900. What we have is a Norwegian minority within a Lutheran minority of the Protestant majority of American religion. Okay, do you get that? Norwegians are a minority within the big bucket or basket, or whatever you want to call it, of Lutherans, but Lutherans are a minority who are regarded as somewhat difficult to understand, right? And why are they difficult to understand? Because if you look at them one way, they kind of look Catholic, right? Because they have liturgical worship, not all Lutherans, but enough Lutherans to make Lutherans look Catholic to some people. But to other people, they look more Protestant and evangelical. So it's a strange group. All right. How did this look to Norwegians in 1845? Here's just a very brief quote from Dietrichson, who's, if any of you who were there yesterday to hear Ralph Meyer's presentation, he talked about Dietrichson as his representative of the Norwegian Synod, the more high church, more aristocratic, more educated group. And Dietrichson described the situation that he found in 1845 this way. The situation here surely demonstrates what happens to the poor immigrant, and poor, that's such an interesting word, right? Is he talking about how much money they had, or that he feels sorry for them, or exactly what's going on? But in any case, the poor immigrant in religious matters when no aid comes from the fatherland. That's another part of that open market and the need to be self-propagating and self-governing and self-supporting. No help is coming from the fatherland. The confusion is terrible. Our dear countrymen, baptized and confirmed in the faith of our fathers, are here divided into 7 or 8 different sects. About 80 of them belong to the Mormon sect. Others are Methodist, Presbyterian, Baptist, Quakers, and followers of Erling Eilertsen. All right, so we have this situation in which there's lack of leadership and support from Norway. So the transnational thing is not really working for them, right? There's not enough back and forth. Of course, there's some back and forth. Dietrichson had come. The Preußes would come. The Korens would come. People came. But it wasn't official help that was coming, right? It wasn't like the Norwegian church said, oh, there are all those Norwegians, all those poor immigrants over in Wisconsin and Minnesota and Iowa who need our support. We should send somebody over there to take care of them. Like, I was just in Germany. There's an American church in Leipzig. Right? What happens in the open market, there's confusion and division. And then there will also be variety among the Norwegians. I'm not going to spend much time on the sentence, but we know that there were many, okay, that they shared a great deal, but without, can you think of it like the state church held things together? There are a lot of impulses, but they're held together by an institution. And when that rubber band, or whatever you want, however you want to think of it, is removed, there's the possibility that those disagreements can blossom into new institutions, both at the local level and at the synodical level, at the level at which they are extra-local connections, let's call it that. There are many. Today, I don't want to spend a lot of time on what those differences were. Rather, I want to emphasize that once it comes apart, the dynamic also begins to move together. And there are two key dates. One is in 1890, when the United Church is founded, and that's this blue circle, right? And I think that this chart actually helps you visualize that it's the center that comes together, and the extremes stay apart. And then again, in 1917, 1918, I'm always getting that wrong, again, up to 90% come together in what's called the Norwegian Lutheran Church in America. So my second point about, okay, you leave behind the familiar institutions, you bring your culture with you, you form new institutions, but those institutions are differentiated by matters of theology and piety. And now matters of theology and piety maybe are mediated by shared ethnicity or by shared culture, right? All right. So how is that happening? There are various institutions and practices that mediate and cultivate connections. Many of them are local. Oh my God, you can barely read it, can you? I'm so sorry. Local congregations are really, really important. What I have here, if I talk loud, can you hear me? Okay. So first look at this side. This little map, if you're going up Interstate 35 from Northfield to Minneapolis, you'll be going along, and you'll come to an exit about 7 miles north. That's Elko New Market. Elko New Market is to the west, but if you go to the east, you come into this area, the Christiana settlement area. And the reason I use this is because I found a good map, right? We could do the same thing in Goodhue County. The point is to see that there are all these congregations that are really close to each other. They're really close to each other. And if we dug into the specifics of those congregational histories, we would learn that part of the reason there are so many has to do with transportation, right? Because how far are you going to walk? How far are you going to take your horse to get to worship? That's a material reason. But there are also, like I said, theological reasons, differences of piety. And so some of these are really close to each other. One of them is Christiana Highview. So it's founded in 1860, and there's its building that was from 1877. Now, move in this direction. This is Trinity Lutheran in Brooklyn. I put Trinity Lutheran in Brooklyn there for two reasons. It's not in Minnesota, or Wisconsin, or Iowa, or North Dakota, or South Dakota, right? It's not it's not a Midwestern congregation, and it's not a rural congregation. It's a city congregation. It was founded in 1890, and its current building was constructed in the 1910s. And then just to have one more variation, this is St. Olaf Lutheran in Red Lodge, Montana. It was founded in 1904, and this building is from the 1920s. Okay, so when we talk about local congregations, there are some things that are similar across all of these kinds of settings, and then there are other things that are different. Obviously, one of the key differences between being rural and being urban is who's around you, right? And how much you are different from the people who are around you. And that degree of difference influences how you think about what you have in common with the people who are with you. Okay, so what are some things that are similar? Oh, I did distribution first, sorry. Lay initiative and leadership. Huge, huge thing that happens in the US is that, for a couple reasons. One, the Norwegian church is not officially sending clergy. And two, because of disestablishment and the need for self-support, lay people gain a lot of power. Well, that doesn't sound very spiritual, but it's true. It's the power of the purse. But before you have the power of the purse, you have just the fact that here we are, baptized and confirmed. There's no pastor. What are we going to do? We may gather together. We may use the resources. Now we're speaking very early, like in the 19th century. We're going to use the stuff we have. We have a hymn book. We maybe have a book of sermons. So lay people can do some things. They can't administer the sacraments. So they want someone to baptize and confirm. They want that to happen. When they organize themselves, sometimes, usually with the help of perhaps an itinerant pastor, then that begins to happen. Finances, really interesting, right? Who's going to pay for things? Probably it takes a couple local congregations to come together to be able to afford a pastor, to pay for a parsonage, and so forth. Usually it's so interesting, it looks kind of like a tax. Right? You're used to paying a church tax. Instead of paying a church tax to the government, you pay a church tax to your congregation. And the records of congregations like those you see there on the right say, this is how much you're supposed to pay if you are in this demographic situation. This is how much you pay if you're in a different kind of situation. So congregations are one of the places that religion and ethnicity really come together, especially in places like Christiana Highview, because almost everyone there is Norwegian, and almost everyone there is Lutheran. So there's not really, if you ask someone, are you doing it because you're Lutheran or because you're doing it because you're Norwegian, I don't know that they would have been able to answer that, right? That those two identity factors are so tight. I suspect in Brooklyn, it would be a little different. Even in Minneapolis, it might have been a little different. So what was going on in the congregation? Obviously worship. Key, right? That's how Lutherans define the church. What is the church? The church is where the Augustana Confession tells us the church is where the word is preached and the sacraments are administered. Now, as a layperson, I always want to say it's where the word is heard and the sacraments are received, right? It's not just speaking, somebody has to hear, and it's not just offering, somebody needs to eat. So that's going on. And it's going on using familiar rituals and well into the 20th century using Norwegian language. There are differences between it where it happens with high church Norwegian Synod people and how it happens with low church Haugianer people, but it's going on everywhere. Other things that are going on. the women's groups are so central, so central. And I don't say that just because I studied them. I study them because they're so central, right? That's why I study them, because they're so important. The women's organizations initially, sometimes they're founded even before there's a congregation. Sometimes the women's organization precedes the organization of a congregation and prompts it to happen. But the stated purposes initially are almost always having to do with support for the congregation and its ministries. How does that happen? It happens by education, learning about those ministries. It happens then by prayer, and it happens by raising money. How is the money raised? Women come together, initially in the rural congregations, probably at somebody's house, for an all-day meeting. And frankly, often that all-day meeting was not just the women. The whole family came, right? Because if you're going to go, we might as well all go. Initially, usually the pastor was there to lead the devotion. But there are interesting examples in which the pastor says, I really think you could do this yourself, right? So they would often have devotion. They do perhaps some kind of handwork together. And then there would be an annual festival where those things are sold. And then the money can go to what? It can go to something in the congregation, or it can go to a ministry beyond the congregation. Now, let's think back about being self-governing and self-supporting. Right away, women didn't get to vote in the congregation. What did they get to do? Think about how money and governance go together. We think it's time to build a church. We think the building needs a basement or an organ, or we need a parsonage. So it's a weird thing that happens. I don't know if it's weird. It's a notable thing that happens among these Norwegian Lutherans, probably not only them, is that what does it mean to be a member of a church? There's something funny that's going on about being able to pay for things and what that does to a sense of membership. I already said a little something about leadership and activities. Eventually, the women's organizations would form federations. So they weren't only local. Insofar as the synods did that for congregations, these different kinds of federations, often they were called a women's missionary federation, did that. They frequently had leadership from pastors' wives and daughters. Not always, but frequently that was the case, and you can understand why that was. So how would women in local congregations, not the ones in Christiana, because they all could know each other, but how about the ones in Christiana and the ones in Fergus Falls? How are they going to know each other? Well, if the pastors are gathering together and the pastors' families are gathering together, then the pastors' wives know each other. What else do I want to say about women's organizations? Oh, yeah. Women's organizations are not a uniquely Norwegian or uniquely Lutheran phenomenon. They are a very common American Protestant phenomenon. So insofar as they have these, it looks very American, not distinctly Lutheran. But within the organization, if they're speaking Norwegian, if they're feeding each other Norwegian food, then it's going to look, if they're singing Norwegian hymns, then it's going to look Norwegian. But they might also use this as an occasion to show off their ability to produce American food, right? So we have to look congregation by congregation. The last thing I want to say about women's organizations is that they develop over time not only with regard to having federations, but they begin to specialize. So especially in the urban congregations, you might get a women's organization that's specifically for young women who are domestic servants. And it might meet on Thursday afternoon because that's their half day off, right? by the time we come into the mid-20th century, you might have, in a large congregation, a women's organization that was specifically for professional women. In the earlier days, they would have been divided by geography, the West Aid and the East Aid, right? Because it's just easier to get together that way. The Lutheran Daughters of the Reformation was a 20th century phenomenon, was specifically for young women. So there was a kind of transition from the youth group or the girls' society. Other local organizations would include things like choirs. Okay. Really important part of what was going on at the local level is education. And here I've put it under 3 categories. The first category is parochial schools. Having said that, unlike the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, Norwegians were much less likely to sponsor a parochial school that was the only school, like rather than taking part in public schools. Most Norwegians, there was a controversy about it, but the outcome was that mostly they made use of the public school. So what they had in their congregation was a kind of school that went maybe around the shoulders, right, at the beginning and the end of the season. Could be the same teachers, but the curriculum would be different. The congregational school is focused on religious education in the Norwegian language into the 20th century. So once again, religion and ethnicity are working together very, very closely. Rural congregations in Minnesota, probably confirmation instruction is going on in Norwegian into the 20s. A second kind of education are what we call academies. This is in the era before public high schools were widely available. So these are secondary education. There were lots of them. We might say Oak Grove in Fargo-Moorhead continues in that tradition, but there aren't many of those left. Insofar as there are Lutheran high schools today, it's a new phenomenon. Some of those just closed. Some of them, like St. Olaf, became colleges. And some of them were really feeders into seminaries. So you have both things going on. It's a really important thing to say about the colleges. All of those synods that I showed you, or almost all of them, had a college. So one important function of those colleges was that they were a focal point for group identity, right? Really important. And that identity early on linked, again, religious and ethnic identity. St. Olaf's earliest purpose statements are very clear. Nothing will be taught in contradiction to the Lutheran confessions, right? They were very clear about that. On the other hand, the medium of instruction was English. So both things are going on. This is a wonderful little piece of material culture from St. Olaf when they were raising money for a dormitory. Some of the female students made a cookbook that they were selling as a fundraiser, and it has almost all American recipes, like scalloped cauliflower. We just ate some cauliflower up in the staff hall. And then it had a special section of Norwegian food. So you can begin to see this sense of separation. Okay, so that moved us into higher education. From academies, there were colleges. There were other kinds of schools. The Lutheran Ladies Seminary in Red Wing. That was not the only women's school. The Lutheran Normal School in Madison, Minnesota. Nursing schools, right? So it was a kind of a big enterprise, but it was never the majority of college-age students who went there, right? So how many Norwegian Lutheran college-age students in Minnesota and Wisconsin were at these schools, the number was far exceeded by the numbers at the University of Wisconsin and the University of Minnesota. And we have to bear that in mind. It's so easy for us to focus on where things are concentrated instead of thinking about how they're dispersed. All right. Social services. Now we're moving even more beyond the local. What are the things that this immigrant community needs to provide for itself? This is the pre-New Deal era, right? This is pre-HMOs. This is pre a lot of things. So what are they providing for themselves? So it's an interesting thing here. When we go back to Speckard's 4 things, right? Shared ancestry, interests, culture, and institutions. Maybe this is interests. They have an interest in taking care of each other. They have an interest in making sure particularly vulnerable members of this large community are taken care of. And so we will see that before very long, Norwegian Lutherans began to found these institutions, and particularly we would point to orphanages, hospitals, and old people's home. This is the old people's home in Stoughton, Wisconsin, which I show you both because I found a picture of it, and because it was my grandfather's last job was to be the administrator of Skolin Sunset Home in Stoughton, Wisconsin. Often they had that kind of sunset home, right? So they're looking into the sunset, what's going to happen? In Chicago, let's just take an example. Let's take an urban example. In 1885, at the suggestion of Pastor Mortensen, 12 women founded the Tabitha Society of Chicago. Very soon, the Tabitha Society divided into separate organizations, taking responsibility for different institutions. In 1892, they were founded a home for the aged and orphans, which became Bethesda Home for the Aged. And they founded the Norwegian Lutheran Children's Home. That came after Islesen had given money. He said, there should be an orphan's home, but you have to work together. And they couldn't manage to do that, so then this came later. In 1894, they founded a hospital, and that hospital eventually had a nursing school. Another group in 1896, 5 congregations. So the first was a group of, it was prompted by a pastor, but it was a group of women, and I don't know their congregational affiliations, right? They could have all been from one congregation. They could have been cousins to each other. The source I read didn't give their names, so there's really no way you can track that down. But in this case, it's 5 congregations that go together, and they found another Norwegian Old People's Home Society. In 1896, again, at the prompting of a pastor, was founded the Lutheran Deaconess Society, which now is Lutheran General of Park Ridge. That gives me an opportunity then to say something about deaconesses, which is an important development. We've talked about women's organizations and the leadership of the women's organizations, but deaconesses gave women a way to have a public work when they couldn't be pastors. And that was very important, and it was connected with Norway. So actually the deaconess movement among Norwegian Lutherans begins in Brooklyn, and it's somewhat related to the Seafarers mission. They bring Elizabeth Fetty from Norway, and she works there. She's doing not just work with the seafarers, but she's doing a lot of what we would call social work. Right? She helps found a similar organization in Minneapolis and also the one in Chicago. Now, I said that this is before the New Deal. But there's an interesting little tidbit in something Lloyd Hustvedt has written about one of the congregations, not Christiana, but in the Goodhue County. He says that in the minutes in 1919, there's evidence that a man came and he wanted to go and live in the Ebenezer home in Minneapolis. So another example of an old people's home, right? And it had been founded, that actually was founded by one woman founded the Ebenezer Society, which is now the largest manager of housing for, now that I've entered this category, I don't even know what to call it, of old people, right? Anyway, he wanted to go live there, and it would cost, he had to make a $1,000 down payment or total in 1919. That's what it was going to cost him, and he only had $200. So he comes to the congregation and tells us something about the congregation. He appeals to the congregation and says, I want to go live in the Ebenezer home. I'm an old person. I don't know what his argument was. We could speculate about what his argument was. And at the first meeting, they just talk about it. And by the time the second meeting comes, he's gone to the county poorhouse. So it's not like there were no other options, but this is an effort of these people to take care of their own. What happens to those organizations is that we're going to begin to see some consolidation over time. But first I want to have this quotation from Sister Ingeborg Sponland, who was the head of the Deaconess Home in Chicago. She writes this in sort of a memoir in 1938. To us deaconesses, truth cries out that all human beings have a soul, which has been bought by the blood of Jesus Christ for the kingdom of heaven. There can be no discrimination as to nationality or creed when it comes to serving our Master. He served all humanity and bids us to follow in his footsteps. To serve people of various nationalities and creeds, we gain a broader vision and a deeper sympathy and understanding, a compassion and love for souls that are without Christ. Interesting, right? So now, the Norwegian Lutheran Deaconess is saying the things that bind us together, our ethnicity and our religion, also compel us to not pay attention to those things in our work. And that leads us then to me to want to say something about foreign missions, somewhat less. The way these were supported parallels some of the things I've already said. There are some independent missionary societies that that's the only thing they're doing, and they're not associated with the synod. There are some that are associated with synods. And on the fields, here we come to transnational, especially I know most about the China mission, there is cooperation between American Norwegians and Norwegian Norwegians. There's also cooperation between other Scandinavians and the Norwegian-Americans. So there's a place where ethnicity, in a sort of pan-ethnic way, is undergirding cooperation that's based on shared religion. They don't go so far, how shall I say this? It does not happen, the lovely administrative third person, it does not happen that they are in cooperation with the Germans from the Missouri Synod. That cooperation was long in the past. Whether that was the choice of the Scandinavians or what the choice of the Germans, we're not going to get into that. The primary fields that Norwegian-American Lutherans were active on were China, Madagascar, and South Africa. And who was doing the work? Of course, many pastors. And there you see the very famous Daniel Nelson family in China. There were also single women who were doing that work. So Agnes Kittleby Hall, some of you have driven by as you've been on our campus. Agnes Kittleby went to China where she was the matron of the boarding school for the missionary children, and there were deaconesses that were doing this work. And if you want to know, you want to think with me about how that affects one person's sense of identity, that's what I'm going to talk about with Gertrude Sovik tomorrow. So now, Lars Boe. Let me see how I'm doing on time. Lars Boe. This is a quotation from Lars Boe in 1938. It is the introduction to the hymnal that was produced that year. Ours is a mediating generation. By training and tradition, we live in the spiritual and cultural land of the fathers. With our children, we are steadily marching into the land of tomorrow. Ours is the wealth of two cultures and often the poverty of the desert wanderer. This gets quoted all the time. We live between memory and reality. I don't know if that makes him different. Don't we all live between memory and reality? Ours is the agony of a divided loyalty and joy in the discovery of a new unity. Like Moses of old, we see the new but cannot fully enter in. To us has been given the task of mediating a culture, of preserving and transferring to our children in a new land the cultural and spiritual values bound up in the character, art, music, literature, and Christian faith of a generation no longer found even in the land from which our fathers came. Lars Boe was a really interesting figure. His father fought in the American Civil War. He's a third-generation American. It's reputed that his Norwegian was passable, but not great. He worked very much in cooperative Lutheranism, starting early on with the Lutheran Commission for Soldiers and Sailors' Welfare during World War I. This is an instance in which the American government was really not willing to deal with all those many kinds of Lutherans, right? So if you guys can get your act together, we'll work with one Lutheran organization. Earlier, he had written in a debate about the so-called English problem, he said, with all due respect for these things, and I love them more than I can say, Norwegian things, they are not an essential part of the Lutheran heritage. Has the day come when we must make a choice? If it has, though I say it with sorrow, I and my house will choose our Lutheran faith. So we come to this sort of moment of shifting dynamics. And obviously I can't go into great detail about this, but I hope this chart gives you a little sense of what I'm calling both ethnic and ecclesial changes that contribute to the decoupling of religious and ethnic identity. Not for everyone, not for every individual, not for every congregation, but on the largest scale, the decoupling of religious and ethnic identity. So the first thing you see is these are immigration rates from 1870 to 2016. Right? That's pretty obvious what's going on, right? You're not replenishing with newcomers from Norway. That's one ethnic change. Another ethnic change is that consequently the third, fourth, and fifth generation, of course, are increasingly participating in American life. Think of all those college students at the University of Minnesota and the University of Wisconsin. Think about the soldiers to whom the Commission for Soldiers and Sailors' Welfare are ministering. All of those Norwegian Lutherans have increased contact with and participation in American life. And then post-World War II, suburbanization is a huge, huge, huge factor. These correspond with some ecclesial changes. One I already suggested, which is that movement into the mainstream. How does that happen? There are two ways that happens. One is cooperation. The Commission for Welfare of Soldiers, which I just said, right? All those Lutheran groups are talking to each other. And those mergers, first in 1890, then in the 19-teens, then again in 1960, when the Norwegian synods join with some of the Germans and some of the Danes to make the American Lutheran Church. And then in 1988, when they join with we call them the Muhlenberg Lutherans or the East Coast Lutherans, which has Swedes and Finns and the rest of the Danes and some more Germans. So think about your soup pot, right? First, you have a soup pot that has just, I don't know what you put in first, or, chickpeas or something. But then you keep adding more and more kinds of vegetables. That's going to decrease, not only naturally, but by the time we get to the mid and late 20th century, very intentionally. There's an effort to downplay, especially at the national level, to downplay ethnic differences, and an effort to open up, rather like Ingeborg Spolund said, to open up the institution to people of various kinds, although it is the case we're moving to the second quarter of the 20th century, that the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America is just about the whitest of all American denominations. So there's maybe there's a pan-ethnic or a racial dynamic that's taken place, that's mergers, and there are other kinds of cooperation. So all those social service agencies began to work together, so now we have Lutheran Social Services of Minnesota, not the Norwegian Lutheran Old People's Home, right? So all of those things are happening. Then that brings me back then to just reiterate the 4 points I made at the beginning. Migration separated Norwegians from familiar religious institutions, but they carried shared religious culture and customs with them. That did not cause all of them to join together, but it facilitated some of them to join together in Lutheran congregations and synods. Within those synods, internal differences of theology and piety were significant, but more recently, certainly by the mid-20th century, increased assimilation and ecclesial consolidation loosened the ties between Lutheran religion and Norwegian ethnicity. And these two photographs of two buildings are meant to illustrate that. So let me end by just telling you what those buildings are. Our Savior's Lutheran Church was a Norwegian synod congregation founded in 1869. In 1912, it moved from downtown Minneapolis to the corner of Chicago and 24th Street, thank you. And that's what you see on the top picture, right? That's the picture. In 1995, it burned down. And what you see at the bottom is the current church. It's a huge glass looking out on the street, and a ministry that is very intentionally outward looking to the Phillips neighborhood, which is one of the most ethnically diverse census tracts, not just in Minneapolis, but in America. And with that, I conclude. With 2 minutes to spare. So, one question maybe.
Thank you. That was very interesting. Yeah, time for one question, and then afterwards, I'm sure you could ask.
I'm happy to talk. Oh my God, I tore off my name tag.
Somebody have a kind of short question?
Yeah.
I have a very short one. Was the introduction to the hymnal by Bo, was that the black hymnal?
Do I know what color it was?
Which we still have a few in our church.
Yeah, it's the Lonsted-Lindemann hymn book, published in 1938.
You don't know what color?
I don't know what color it is. Do you know what color it is? Black. Okay. Yeah. I never used it myself. Because mostly I grew up in a post-World War II mission congregation, right? So founded in the 1940s in a university town, ethnicity was not a key factor. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, DeAne.